All right, guys. So here it is, your chapter 33 video lecture, just to help you guys get a little bit of that extra content knowledge so you can do well on the quizzes and ultimately do well on the tests. This is on the Great War, World War I, which is obviously a huge pivot point in AP World History where we go from Unit 5 to Unit 6, in which it shifts from a world heavily dominated by European powers to those European powers now being questioned as they basically spent the first part of the 20th century slaughtering each other. So where it all starts with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo, which was in then Bosnia-Herzegovina. Basically, the way it started was because the Austro-Hungarian Empire controlled Bosnia-Herzegovina, and the assassin of Archduke Francis Ferdinand was a member of the Black Hand, and they wanted to be independent. Ferdinand was actually in favor of Serbian autonomy, which was kind of ironic in a way, but that was obviously not enough for Serbian extremists who wanted their own country. By the way, Serbia is an independent country today in 2019. The person who assassinated him was this guy, Gavrilo Princip, a teenager actually, one of 7 assassins who first they chickened out a little bit. They chose not to assassinate. Then they messed it up, and then one of them attempted suicide. But actually, Princip shot Ferdinand and his wife as they were on their way to visit victims of the first assassination attempt. Basically, one of them threw a bomb at Franz Ferdinand. It missed and went off and hit a bunch of other people, and they were sent to the hospital. He was actually eating a sandwich, and their caravan stopped right in front of the sandwich shop he was at. He went out, shot Ferdinand and his wife to death. Basically, I read that Ferdinand's last words were to his wife, "Sophie, you can't die for the children." Princip tried to commit suicide, did not succeed, and was taken to prison. He was too young to be executed and was sentenced to 20 years in prison, where he died of tuberculosis, which is the end of his story. But the outcome of his assassination could not have been bigger. It was the first conflict that was a truly world war. It was considered to be the war of that would end all wars. Obviously, it did not. The conservative estimates say that 15 million people died, 5 million of which were people who were non-combatants, basically people who were civilians. 20 million injured for life. You see lots of ghastly pictures of people who were injured during this war. It ended 4 empires, and it gave the rise of 9 new countries. Huge global dislocations, and it basically marked the beginning of the end of Europe's domination of the globe, and we'll see the United States sort of take that spot for a good portion of the world's history, even up to today, one could contend. But it was a result of a culmination of competing nationalism. So with the rise of nation states and democratic independent nation states, especially in the South and Eastern Europe, we have people who either had their own countries or people who wanted to have their own countries, which consisted of parts of other countries. There was also rivalry among empires. We see imperialism as a big cause of this as well, especially between Britain and Germany. Britain had a great empire. Germany did not. Germany wanted it. Britain did not want Germany to sort of take what they had. And basically because of that, we see increasing tensions between those two countries especially, and very inflexible diplomatic alliances, Germany, France, England, and Russia, to be clear. But the national aspirations, which according to the textbook was an inevitable outcome of the French Revolution. We have all sorts of countries sort of taking control of their own country, as well as it being an overall universal effort, meaning it wasn't just something rich people did anymore. Everybody from top to bottom in the country was involved in the nation state, more so than they had been before. Self-determination and independence movement in Belgium, and the unification of Italy, and the unification of Germany, which we saw in the previous unit. We also see nationalism in the multinational empires, especially Austro-Hungary, which obviously no longer existed after this. Slavs that lived in southeastern Europe, especially people like Serbians, Bosnians, I guess Herzegovinians as well, all wanted their own independent countries, but Austro-Hungary stood in the way. The Russian Empire, we have Polish people, we have the Ukrainians, we have the various Baltic states, which is Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, all wanting their own country. In the Ottoman Empire, which was massive, we have Greeks, Serbians, Romanians, and Bulgarians all wanting their own countries. Most of these places are their own free independent country today in 2019, but we see their beginnings of their aspirations way, 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 way back in the early part of the 20th century. We also have national rivalries. The British Empire was kind of falling apart in 1870. 32% of the world industrial output was from Britain. Germany was 13%. By 1914, it had dropped to 14%. There was a great deal of imperial competition. Germany was a latecomer, but very, very aggressive. They wanted territories all over the world, whether it was in Southeast Asia or in Africa. And there were some small-scale disputes, but nothing to the degree of World War I. There's also a race in terms of armaments. There's a huge arms race between the United Kingdom and Germany to control the seas. A very, very key part of controlling the world is controlling the routes of trade, and to control that, you need to control the seas, which led to the construction of a huge armored warship called the Dreadnought, which is a new generation of warship. This is kind of the granddaddy of destroyers and aircraft carriers and that sort of thing. Germany developed their own special kind of ship as well, which we'll get to in a bit. Public opinion was a big one as well. This was sort of the beginning of the age of media. Newspapers were cheap and way more accessible than they had ever been before. Literacy rates had gone up thanks to the Industrial Revolution and more kids going to school. So more people had access to newspapers, but there wasn't a whole lot of accountability in terms of what you put in those newspapers. So you could kind of lie and put pressure on politicians to be responsible to public opinion, but public opinion is very easily swayed. And a lot of times people who were in positions of power did things that weren't necessarily good for the people, but basically instead were something that the people wanted. But what the people want is not necessarily what the people need. I mean, if it was up to me, I would eat cheeseburgers all day, but that's not really good for me now, is it? Understandings and alliances. It was this sort of understanding that you have an alliance with somebody, you have to go to war if they do. And unfortunately, everybody was all about that life, which caused a massive chain reaction, which led to the death of 15 million people in this World War. First, we have the Triple Alliance. That's the one that's kind of easier to remember because there's no French-sounding name in it, so France isn't it. So you have Germany, Austria-Hungary, and they were joined by the Italians in 1882. Italians did not have that big of an effect in this war. And you also had the Triple Entente. It sounds French because France is in it. Russia, France, and the United Kingdom, which is interesting because those three countries did not really like each other that much, but they formed an uneasy alliance, and really the only reason the United Kingdom got involved was because Germany, when they start the war, invaded Belgium, and Belgium was the United Kingdom's ally, so they had to go to war with it. But actually, the United Kingdom hated France and hated Russia, and actually had fought them within the previous 100 years. So British soldiers died fighting both of these countries, and now they're fighting on their side. Interesting. What the Entente wanted was basically, they were concerned about the alliance between Germany and Austria-Hungary, which made sense because culturally they're very similar. They speak the same language, a lot of the same holidays, that sort of thing. And there was Kathy Little Eyes wants people to sub. There was concerns about a two-front war. They were worried about English domination of the sea. They were worried about the possibility of a French attack and Russian interference over Austrian Balkan policies. Russia and the Balkan states had a close relationship due to their Slavic background. Concerns of the alliance. I think this is backwards, actually, but that's okay. Russia worried about strong German Austro-Hungarian alliance. The United Kingdom was concerned with maintaining a balance of power, that balance being the United Kingdom is in power and nobody else really is. France was worried about hostilities with Germany because they're right next to each other. In fact, they had fought each other previously in the Franco-Prussian War when Germany was split into different places, one of those being Prussia. And they were worried about a military pact not being honored. It was signed in the summer of 1914, and it had reciprocal treaty obligations, but obviously the military pact did not do anything to stop a world war because it happened. So here's what we're talking about. We're talking about a two-front war. Germany and Austria-Hungary have the disadvantage that they're in the middle, so they have to fight two fronts. So they have to fight this front over here, which is Russia, and this front over here, which is France and England. Spain stayed neutral in this. Spain was kind of going through their own sort of turmoil in terms of dealing with a monarchy and perhaps beginnings of a sort of fascist government, so they stayed out of it. But they had Germany and Austria-Hungary had to fight a two-front war. So their plan was the Schlieffen Plan, which was very similar to the French plan the 17th. Basically attack as fast as possible and try to end the war as quickly as possible. The German Schlieffen Plan was similar. They were afraid that they were going to get encircled, so their idea was to attack France as possible, take them out of the war, and then take care of Russia. The logic being France was way more organized and way more industrialized. It would make sense to take them out. Russia didn't really even have much in the way of factories and railroads yet, so they wouldn't be able to mobilize their militaries quickly, and they could then turn around and attack them. And it was basically, like I said, on the condition of how well the enemy could mobilize or get their army into shape. So the declarations of war started. So after Franz Ferdinand gets shot to death by Gavrilo Princip, the Austrians issued an ultimatum to the Serbs. The Austrians then declare war on the Serbs. Russia was allied with Serbia, so they mobilized to defend them. Germany was allied with the Austrians, so they basically went to war with the Russians. And then the French declared war on Germany because France was friends with Russia. Germans declared war on France and invaded Belgium. Because they invaded Belgium, Britain came to the defense of Belgium, and boom, World War I is in full swing. It became not this quick war. Everybody thought it would be over by Christmas. This war that started in August. It was 3 years of essentially stalemate. This begins the whole concept of trench warfare on the Western Front. There's trenches built from the English Channel all the way to Switzerland. In the East, there was a lot more movement. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March 1918 placed pretty much the Entente in control. Moving along, what made this a trench warfare was new military technology, two of which were barbed wire and machine guns, especially machine guns. Basically, you could not get anything going because a machine gun would mow you down. And a lot of the tactics used back then were outdated. For example, Russia used horses. They used the cavalry. They tried to charge machine gun turrets with horses. It did not work well, needless to say, and a lot of poor horses died in a war they didn't know about or understand. Poor horses. Gas was then used, poisonous gas, mustard gas. It was dropped by German troops to basically use sort of chemical warfare, which basically, if you breathed it in, it caused your lungs to corrode and fall apart inside of your own body. Unfortunately, gas is very uncontrollable. A shift in the wind can all of a sudden shift that gas that was meant for your enemy back on yourself, and it causes basically lifelong misery and turmoil. It's actually illegal to use now in warfare, but that's one of those things that if you lose, then you'll be punished. If you win, then who's going to punish you? You won. Tanks were initially effective, but the ground was quickly lost to counterattacks. Tanks really weren't that good yet in order to really be a huge decisive factor. Airplanes were really not much of a factor. They were able to bomb a little bit, maybe strafe, which is where they fly down and shoot a machine gun at you, but more than anything else, they're used for just getting information. They're used for reconnaissance. They also had dirigibles, which were blimps. Those kind of dropped bombs on like factory targets that made munitions, but that was about it. Submarines were a big one. Submarines were developed by the Germans, but they were, again, very primitive. You couldn't get any warning if there was a submarine, and they basically attacked without warning, and they didn't always know which boats they were attacking. So all of this leads to massive casualties. Along with these new technologies, we have armies that were bigger than ever before. We had military drafts of every single side in this conflict, in which every single male between the ages of like 18 and 35 was expected to fight in the military if they were physically capable. Um, in one battle alone in Verdun in 1916, we had about 300,000 French killed, about the same with the Germans, but fewer than 1,000 or 160,000 bodies recovered. At the Somme, which is one of the most violent battles in a very, very violent war, Britain gained a few thousand yards at the cost of 420,000 casualties. 500,000 people died in one battle for a few thousand yards, for about 10, 20 football fields worth of territory. Just staggering amount of losses with very, very little movement in terms of the war. And the way it worked was you were basically stuck in the hole, which was the sort of poetic element was not lost on these people. You were kind of digging your own grave in a way. So you had your trench and you had your enemy trench. Behind you, you had rows and rows and rows of artillery, which launched bombs on the enemy's trench. When they stopped, you got up and tried to run across no man's land, which was lined with barbed wire and landmines, and try to take the enemy's trench. Well, they had the same thing, so it was this constant back and forth. There was also warfare in Southwest Asia as well, with the Ottoman Empire, but that was a little bit less violent. It was still quite violent, but it wasn't quite as horrific as over in Western Europe and there as well. Okay. At home, the war saw its effects as well. The implication of modern industrial war of a home front. The government took control of the economy, and everyone, especially women, were expected to take part in the war effort, which consisted of making war munitions. However, this was before they really knew what these things did. And you had a lot of women die of TNT poisoning, basically constantly ingesting poisonous chemicals involved in bomb making and bullet making, and a lot of women would basically get sick and die. And one of the symptoms would be yellow skin, orange hair, and that sort of thing. We also see the bombing of civilian areas by Zeppelins, which I'd mentioned previously. We also see lots of propaganda, usually made by the government, maintenance of public support for the war, and a lot of just things that were not true. The irony of it is that the disbelief of World War I propaganda made the belief in World War II atrocities more difficult. So when you keep saying in 1914 that the Germans are evil and they kill people and they rape women and all that, and people are like, that's not true. Well, when you tell people, oh, the Germans are actually slaughtering Jewish people and committing genocide, people say, that's not true. You lied in World War I. What makes me think you're not lying now? But it was a global involvement. There was importation of troops from all colonies, mostly because the United Kingdom and France and those types of places didn't really have any other troops left to use themselves. They were just out of young men, so they recruited young men from places like Austria, New Zealand, Canada. France would employ troops, even black troops, from places like Senegal, from places like Monaco, those types of places. England also used troops from India as well, so you also saw brown and black people fighting alongside white people, even though they didn't have the same rights and affordances in their same place. The Japanese also got involved in the sense that they had basically intentions of making a move on China as the European powers were now distracted with their own conflict. We'll get to that later. The Russian Empire saw a massive collapse. With the Russians' complete embarrassment and defeat in this war, this became a sign to the communists that they needed to take over and make a change. And there was also a little help from Germany as well. Germany smuggled the communist leader Vladimir Lenin into Russia. Lenin had been living in exile in Central Europe, in France, among other places. He got moved in, and shortly thereafter, a revolution started. And this was designed by Germany to basically knock Russia out of the war, and it worked. With Russia out of the war, Poland, Baltic countries, Ukraine were ceded to the Central Powers in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, and basically the communist revolution was in full swing. The United States would later get involved, not until the war was about half over, due to economic considerations. The United States sold a whole bunch of stuff to their allies, which were very flimsy at the time. They sold a lot of munitions to France and England, but France and England didn't quite have the money to pay for it, so they racked up huge amount of debts. But the worry was, if France and England didn't win the war, they can't really pay those debts back. So America was probably always going to fight on the side of France and England because they want to get their money. But what sort of pushed it over the edge was a German blockade of British overseas trades with submarine patrols. Submarines shot out British ships, and sort of one of the tipping points was the sinking of the Lusitania, which was a civilian ship that was carrying civilians to England, but also on that civilian ship was a bunch of guns and bullets and that sort of thing. That was a pretty common thing. Basically, you would have like a cruise ship, and on the bottom of it, you would have a whole bunch of guns and stuff that they were selling to England. The United States declared war in April of 1917. What's actually not mentioned here as well is that Germany also tried to do a secret alliance with Mexico, of all places, and get Mexico to fight the United States, kind of like what they did with Russia. It was the Zimmermann Telegram. And the idea was Mexico would start a war with the United States to reacquire the territory they had lost in the Mexican-American War, which was about half a century earlier. Needless to say, Mexico saw the telegram and basically said, no, this is probably not going to happen. And that was one of the other final straws that got the U.S. to fight in the war. It wasn't actually the Lusitania, it was actually the Zimmermann Telegram. In the fall of 1918, Central Powers were exhausted. Bulgaria and the Ottomans and Austria-Hungary were basically surrendering. And in November of 1918, an armistice was declared. Now, an armistice is not a surrender. It's basically both sides agree to stop fighting. It's not necessarily a surrender. And this leads to the Paris settlement. There was a peace conference, and this was a huge point because basically you had this big, nasty war, and you want to be able to set up terms so that you don't have another big, nasty war. Needless to say, because this is World War I and we have a World War II, this peace conference did not really work. Central Powers were not really allowed to participate, and the peace was dictated. Basically, France and England said what the peace terms were, and Germany just had to deal with it. Woodrow Wilson, the American president at the time, tried to issue 14 points, which is a bit more diplomatic and less harsh, but those were not necessarily followed or listened to by the Central Powers. And the main result of the territorial changes was Germany was greatly reduced. They lost all of their imperial holdings overseas. They were not really allowed to have an army anymore, and they had to pay back all of the damages to military installations in France and Great Britain, which was just absurd. It was just a catastrophic result for Germany, something that they could not reasonably do. The Ottoman Empire also fell apart. The Treaty of Sèvres removed Balkan and Arab provinces and allowed for the European occupation of South and East Anatolia. So basically, European powers like England and France would control the Ottoman Empire, what used to be the Ottoman Empire. Mustafa Kemal, aka Ataturk, would lead an uprising against the Sultanate, who was in charge of the Ottoman Empire, and would create the Republic of Turkey. He would be recognized by the Allies in the Treaty of Lausanne, and he tried to basically shift the Ottoman Empire from an Islamic government to a secular government. And actually, he did do a lot of things that were very progressive in terms of the treatment of women and the treatment of people who weren't Islamic. He tried to make it a more secular government. However, that would not necessarily be totally successful for long. In Southwest Asia, we see a lot of change in territorial holdings after that. Basically, the Ottoman Empire used to control all this. Now they did not. We see the sort of mandate era take place in which countries like Israel and Syria and Transjordan would all see huge, huge, huge changes. The League of Nations was an attempt to sort of create a multinational organization in which conflicts would be settled through diplomacy rather than through warfare. Needless to say, it didn't necessarily work. 42 original member states, 26 non-European ones. It was the application of Wilson's concept of self-determination, that they would honor people who wanted to rule themselves, who were determined to rule themselves. And a mandate system was created to control formerly colonized areas. And this was sort of a very, very flimsy type of imperialism. It was this idea that a country was not ready to control themselves, so another country would basically help them out until they were. But really, this was just imperialism. We see this occur in the areas around Israel, in which the United Kingdom would set up the mandate system, which they would say, you can be independent once you are ready to be independent. And we see challenges to European preeminence. With Europe slaughtering each other, a lot of people saw this as the proof positive that Europe was in no position to tell anybody what to do outside of Europe. Big, huge loss of overseas investments in foreign markets. It was a reversal of the economic relationship with the United States. Before World War I, it was Europe investing in the United States, giving loans to the United States. Now we see the tables turn. It's the United States investing in Europe and trying to prop up Europe after Europe had destroyed itself with war, and the United States stayed comfortably on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. Europe's global hegemony weakened. Hegemony means like global power, to be able to control the world, so to speak. And Europe no longer had that. They were no longer the big dog on the world stage. And we see the spread of revolutionary ideas to colonies. So, for example, Gandhi, who was the revolutionary leader of India, would be one of those types of people who would sort of absorb these revolutionary ideas and apply it to formerly European colonies like India. And we see this spread also in Vietnam, for example, with Ho Chi Minh leading the independence movement in Vietnam. So that's basically the big changes that we see as a result of World War I. Hopefully this helps you understand things a little bit better and more easily. And best of luck if you are taking the quiz.